started, in the eyes of some of you probably, half an hour later than we should have done. This arises from confusion in some of the announcements that were made as to when this talk will begin. In some places it says 4:30, in some places it says 5. I'm disorientated anyway. If you were to ask me at a split second's notice where I am, I wouldn't know. Every evening I'm in a different city. It's 6 weeks now since I left London on the round-the-world lecture tour through South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. I know that yesterday was Calgary. I know that the day before that was Victoria and Vancouver. Before that, I think I had 2 Easter Sundays, which is the quirk which happens when you leave Fiji traveling eastwards. I didn't try lecturing to the Fiji islanders. I don't think they would have appreciated much of what I'm going to tell you in the course of this evening. I suspect that some of you won't appreciate what I'm going to say either. Not because you're foes rather than friends, but because some of what I'm going to tell you is so unpleasant and so distasteful that in fact it's going to take some time for your brains to digest it, rather like an exotic dish which will be fed to you. It took me some time to digest it. I don't set out when I write books. I don't set out to try and find controversial things. If any of you are thinking of writing books later on, let me warn you to avoid trying to find controversies to write, because controversies don't sell books. It has to be the right kind of controversy, and you can't say in advance what that kind of controversy is. I wrote a book about 15 or 20 years ago. In fact, it was the occasion of my first visit to Toronto. I visited Toronto, I think, in 1965 or 66, for the first time in my life, to take part in a television program called Front Page Challenge, which I don't know if it still runs on your television program. It does still run. And on that occasion, I was the Front Page Challenge because of that book I'd written. It was about a Polish Prime Minister who had died under mysterious circumstances. And I wrote a book presenting a pretty credible case for the fact that apparently we had done him in. It wasn't suitless. It was highly convenient for us to do him in. And because I presented the evidence backing this up, the English newspapers ran this world newspaper to make headlines out of it for several days. We had 4 or 5 David Frost programs on television. And as I say, I came over to the Front Page Challenge, which shows the kind of controversy that it aroused. And yet we sold a total of 950 books, I think, at that particular book. Financially, commercially, a disaster. Because I don't have any academic title. It's very kind of Mr. Tom to promote me professor, but I don't. I'm plain Mr. If I want to be taken seriously, sometimes I put on a dark suit. So that's the only way I can be taken seriously. I would go so far as to say that the mere fact that I don't have a PhD, and I don't have a doctor, and I don't have a professor in front of my name, I'm not even Lord Dacre or some other name like that, I'm plain Mr. The fact that I have to rely on publishers to publish my books means that I have to be somewhat more careful about the way I write history than the average professor who has a university chair, who has an income, who has a pension to fall back on. I don't have any of that. I have to support myself entirely by the fruits of my pen, which means that if I start making a string of moves, within a year or two, my writing career will be over. Publishers like Macmillan's, Viking Press, Bantam, Doubleday, the other publishers who publish me, they will turn their back on me and they'll say, "Thank you very much, Mr. Irving, a nice book, but take it elsewhere." Well, publishers have begun saying to me, "Thank you very much, Mr. Irving, a nice book, but take it elsewhere," but not because I'm getting it wrong. They're doing that because I'm getting it right. I've written a manuscript about Winston Churchill's life now. It took the same length of time to write that as it took me to write my biography of Adolf Hitler, which was a 10-year project. I started that when I was about 23 or 24, and I finished that book in 1975. It was published around the world, England, Germany, Italy, Japan, or everywhere. It was called Hitler's War. And because it took 10 years to write, I think I probably got a bit closer to the truth than the other historians and authors and professors and people who hadn't spent 10 years dedicating their lives to one particular research project. I think probably that being a professional author, I have an advantage over the academics in that I can devote very much more money to research than the academic can. And being an English professional author means that I have an even better chance. The German authors, if I may explain that in a minute, a German author who writes a book, it may be a wonderful book, but almost certainly it will never be translated into the language that I mentioned. It will stay in the German language, and that's that. So this has 2 side effects on the books that he writes. First of all, if the publisher takes a dislike to what he's written, then he's going to have to toe the publisher's line. I don't have to. When the German publisher didn't like my Hitler biography, and without telling me, changed large numbers of paragraphs in the book, in fact wrote all sorts of paragraphs into my book, without telling you that I found it out on the day the book was published in 1975. Being an English author with many markets, many countries, I was able to tell the German publisher Ullstein by telegram, you will not print any more copies of that book. The copies that you have printed you will take out of bookshops immediately. I have no interest in publishing a book which I don't believe in. The German author can't do that. So you have these two side effects. If you're a German professor or a German historian, you can't afford to dedicate huge research funds to writing a book, and you've got to. Particularly if you're writing about the Second World War and the period thereafter, because the historians of that period, the records of that period, rather, the documents are scattered all over the globe now. Very, very few of them, fortunately, have been restituted to German archives. They're down in Washington, up here in Ottawa, and in the Public Archives of Canada. They're in Moscow, of course, they're in East Germany. You've got to do a great deal of expensive travel to get down to the truth. So the result is that if you're a German historian, or even a rather lazy English historian, you won't bother to do the legwork. You won't bother to do the commercial, expensive research that getting at the truth involves. No one can actually establish 100% of the truth. You get quite easily within about 80% of the truth, and then it gets proportionately more difficult, rather like an exponential mathematical curve. You have to expend more and more and more money the closer you get to that line of where the absolute truth once was. You never actually find it, because there's always distorting influences, fallible memories, fake documents, faulty translations, which prevent you from getting absolutely on that absolute truth line. And if you're willing to dedicate enough money and time to it, you will get quite close to it. But the professors can't, because they're frightened of their jobs. It's a kind of self-perpetuating propaganda, particularly after a great world war. During the war you lied, and that's right. We lied better probably than anybody else in the Second World War. The English are probably a nation of born liars, and we had one of the biggest liars lying on our behalf, Mr. Winston Churchill. Magnificent liar. He himself said, the truth is so precious, you have to surround it with a bodyguard of lies. That famous phrase of Winston Churchill's, a bodyguard of lies. And he proved very proficient at that. And this propaganda flywheel, which began to spin during the war, churning out the lies about the enemy, because we have to do that, we have to do it through the Falklands War just the same. This propaganda flywheel continues to spin, because although it takes very little to start it moving, there are absolutely no forces at all interested in stopping that flywheel. Only if you are kind of pure an academic historian with a kind of devil-may-care attitude are you going to stand up and put your shoulder to the flywheel and stop that flywheel spinning. The politicians who started the flywheel going, the generals, the propagandists who started that propaganda flywheel spinning, they are not going to stop it. They've got no interest, because if you're a prime minister or a general or field marshal, chiefs of staff who fought a war on the basis of lies and propaganda, psychological warfare, you're not going to stand up on V-Day +1, Victory Day +1, and say, all right, chaps, we got peace now, we got the victory, now we can admit it was all an April Fool's joke. It wasn't true. The British Empire wasn't threatened. That we weren't fighting the level in carnage and the rest of it. All these war aims that we set up during the Second World War. You can't stand up on May the 10th, 1945 and say it was all just a scam. So it's easier to allow the flywheel to continue spinning, and it keeps spinning, because nobody, the newspaper editors, the journalists, the politicians, are not going to stop it spinning. And the historians get caught up in the cogwheels, the lesser cogwheels that flywheel continues to drive. Because the historians are in part promoted by the establishment which set the flywheel going. In Germany, of course, we instituted a re-education program in Germany as part of the Morgenthau plan, and then subsequently became part of the Joint Chief of Staff Directive 1067. So we insisted on the re-education of Germans. We installed professors of history there who could rely on to teach history in the sense that we wanted. And of course, they in turn trained historians, other professors, students who became PhDs in history under them. Of course, they weren't going to upset their professor. So gradually, it's a self-perpetuating process. The history gets written by the people who've written the history before, and very, very seldom do they learn to think sideways. But if I was to consider what my one advantage has been, it's not only that I'm an English author with all the commercial advantages that has as an author, it's that I'm an untrained historian. I haven't been trained in university or anywhere else how to write. In fact, the only examination I ever failed in my life was history. I don't mind admitting that. O-level history, the most menial, the most humble examination in history in England I failed because I couldn't remember dates. But I've become a historian out of, I suppose, pure chance. And not having learned history at school, not having been taught history at university, I haven't really learned how to distort history. It's not a deliberate distortion of history. I haven't learned how to be part of the flywheel process, which I mentioned. When you go to university, the first thing that happens to you as a student is you're given a list of set books. The department hands it to you as you come in as a freshman. The fresher, he gets the set books list, he goes down to the bookshops and he buys as many books as he can afford on the set books list, and they automatically give him a kind of blinkered vision. He soaks up the opinions of the professors before him, and he can't think sideways anymore. He's not really capable of finding logical explanations or even asking logical questions if they fall outside the vision of the blinkers that have been put on him by the set books. And you know how these professors write. They don't have time to go and do the research, they don't have money either. The university doesn't give huge research grants to historians anymore. And so they tend to buy one book on a subject, and having bought one book on a subject, they buy another, and the professor is going to buy 20 books on a subject, and he himself is going to write book number 21. And that counts as research. Buying the printed books with they prefer to read the books. The professors, they read the books with the printed index, and preferably books with nice illustrations too, to break up the monotony of the text of it. They don't like really going to the archives, and in particular, they don't like reading the handwritten documents where much of the truth is buried. And so this is the way the legends begin. One professor sets up a hypothesis. In Germany, for example, Professor Hilgruber in Cologne, he sets up a hypothesis. And along comes Professor Jakobsen in Bonn, and he quotes what Hilgruber has written. And then comes Professor Jekyll in Stuttgart, a famous German professor, and he quotes what Jakobsen and Hilgruber wrote before him. And you've got three sources all of a sudden, all saying the same thing, so it must be true. The fact that it's all inverted on this one pyramid, this one professor started this hair running. Nobody notices that anymore, because there are three people with the professor in front of their name, all saying the same thing. And it's self-perpetuating. Along comes Professor Martin Borchardt in the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, one of the biggest institutes of history of Europe, and he finds that these three have written this thing, and he quotes them. He quotes them. The footnotes, and it's very impressive. Professor Hilgruber, Professor Jekyll, Professor Jakobsen all had the same ideas, and so therefore it must be true. Four professors. Four dogs running around in a circle, chasing their own tail. Getting no closer to the centre of the circle, of course, but it looks like the truth. And more professors come, students and PhD students, they write their theses, they puff more air into this soap bubble. The little soap bubble, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger as more and more hot air is pumped into it. Like this. A hypothesis set up about how something happened. This big soap bubble with more and more professors pumping hot air and the authority of their names into it. And they're just terrified as it gets bigger and bigger, this brilliantly technicolor illuminated soap bubble, that some idiot is going to come along and prick it. And I'm that prick. I'm the one who burst that soap bubble. And I am. I'm the one that they cannot stand it. Because they end up with soap all over their face, or in modern terminology we say egg all over their face. So for example, I took the biggest legend of post-war history, which is the legend attached to the Holocaust. I'm not saying the Holocaust itself, but the legend attached to the Holocaust that Adolf Hitler ordered the killing of 606 million Jews, or whatever. And I don't look at the second part of that sentence, about the 6 million Jews, the killing of the 6 million Jews. I look at the first part, and I say, let's examine that. Adolf Hitler ordered it. The historians can't even find evidence that he knew it was going on. They've all copied each other. They've been running around in circles for 40 years. They've all assumed it must be so because it stands to reason, doesn't it? That the man at the top knew because Hollywood has told us the man was omniscient and omnipotent. But when I come forward, prick that I am, and go into that soap bubble, blow the whole thing up, they come with smear techniques. They attack me with handbills, they attack me with brochures, they attack me in the press, they ban me from the campus. Because I've been saying since 1977, produce one wartime document, just one genuine wartime document showing that Adolf Hitler even knew it was going on. They can't do it. I will pay £1,000. I usually go around these television stations with a wad of £1,000 in my pocket. The last time I did that was in Melbourne. I was a bit nervous because in Melbourne 3 weeks ago the newspapers announced my coming. No, it's Sydney. They announced my coming, Good Morning Australia, their television program, and the newspapers that morning said Mr. Irving's going to be there with his £1,000, and the producers announced they've got an Australian historian who has the document. So I thought, oh dear. So I kept the money in my inside pocket until I saw what the colour of his document was. And it was a very harmless thing. He came up with quotations out of the Goebbels diaries that proved that Goebbels knew what was going on, the Minister of Propaganda. He came up with quotations that proved that Himmler knew what was going on. And that was as far as he got. I say, where's the proof that Hitler knew it was going on? That's what it's all about. And then, of course, it was just he then said, can I tell the listener something about Mr. Irving personally? And I said, this is the level at which the debate resorts. Every time I ask for the proof. And this is very embarrassing. A.J.P. Taylor came up in a TV studio a few months ago, and he said, Irving, this business of £1,000 you offer for the document, it's very undignified, isn't it, for a historian to go around doing that kind of thing? And I say, it's undignified to me, that's true, but it's embarrassing for you and the rest of you. Because you've all been maintaining a fact. You've all been claiming something about Adolf Hitler, and you can't even produce the kind of evidence that would stand up in a magistrate's court to convict an English gypsy of bicycle stealing. So, I mean, there must be a reason for it. There must be a solution. How I arrived at this extraordinary position, believe me, when I set out to write the Hitler biography, I didn't want to find it out. I had no idea I was going to find it out. I was deeply shocked when I found it out. At the end of 8 years, approximately, when I finished the first draft of 4,000 pages on the Hitler biography, I realized that writing it from behind Hitler's desk without trying, when you read the book, you can still get it, I think, the bookshops through Macmillan's. When you read my Hitler biography, you see that, rather like a novelist, I've used a bit of a trick. I've got the reader working himself into the position of Adolf Hitler himself, so that the reader gets the same input that Hitler got, sitting behind his desk. He's getting the same input, the telegrams from the diplomats, the messages from the ambassadors and the generals are coming in to him, and he is reaching decisions on the basis of this input. And the little novelist tricks, like the fact that an ambassador doesn't go across to see Hitler at the chancellery. In my book, the ambassador comes in to see Hitler. You see, little details, little tricks like that. So in no time at all, you've got the reader identifying with Hitler. And it's a very odd experience because they begin to sympathize with him. And at the end of the book, in fact, I've got a lot of Jewish friends who telephoned me. David Kahn, for example, wrote the famous book, The Codebreaker, saying, David, he called me something unmentionable. I said, why? He said, you remember you told me 3 or 4 years ago I wasn't going to be able to put the book down with dry eyes, and that has happened. I just put the book down and I'm crying like a baby, which I think is a great, great, great achievement, because that means that he's begun to try and understand what was going on inside this man's brain, which is why I wrote a book like that. Because we've got to try and understand what makes people like that tick. How they can reach these inhumane decisions and take these extraordinary steps, risking their entire livelihoods and people and destiny of their own nation. What makes them so sure that they're right? And why they do it? And when you understand what is passing across his desk, it all begins to make sense. And as I say, if we've written the first 4,000 pages of this manuscript, I realized that there was this gap. That nowhere had I got any document showing that he was even aware of what was going on. That he wasn't omnipotent, he wasn't omniscient. Auschwitz, Treblinka, the extermination camps, none of this had come across his desk at all, as far as I could see. So I hired a researcher to go through all the archives again, just in case I'd missed anything, if possible. Because you're learning as you're going along, of course. And she went through the archives again, Nuremberg State Archives, Freiburg Federal Archives, military archives, foreign office archives, and on all the rest. She turned out more documents. And the final picture that emerges is that you end up with a file of authentic documents on Hitler and the final solution to the Jewish problem, on which the only documents that are in that file, the only wartime documents, show him extending his hand to prevent anything nasty happening to the Jews. And you touch your head and you think, what's going on? Here we are, 1965, 1975, the book's finished. For 30 years the world has been saying something else, and yet all the documents point in another direction. Now this really is what separates the historians, I suppose, from the journalists. The journalists would think, my God, the editor would fire me if I write this. The historian was interested in getting at that 100% truth, says to himself, there must be a logical explanation for the way the documents present themselves. And you remember I said that it's a file of authentic documents. Obviously you've done some whittling down of the documents. You're deciding on what basis you're selecting your evidence. And I think there's a genuine basis for selecting the evidence. For example, I won't accept what anybody said in the war crimes trials. What some SS gangster says in order to get himself off the hook, knowing that Hitler is dead. There's no reason to accept that kind of evidence. If the documentary wartime evidence is there in abundance, you don't have to read between the lines in it. If, for example, you've got the entire handwritten notes of Himmler on his telephone conversations, why bother to wonder what he's thinking? Because you've got what he himself is saying on the telephone. It's interesting, of course. We now know that in Tel Aviv or Haifa they have Himmler's entire private diary. It's there in the university, it's not being released at present. Surely if I was wrong, and my hypothesis has been, I suppose, broadcast in all the media around the world now again and again over the last 10 years, surely if I was wrong, these historians in Tel Aviv or Haifa would have come forward with Himmler's diary and saying, there you are, Irving, egg all over your face, now pay up. If I'm wrong, I will pay up. I don't mind. I'm not grinding any axe. My only axe I'm grinding is not against the Jews or anybody like that. I'm grinding an axe against my fellow historians who've made life too easy for themselves by making assumptions without any kind of base at all. Again and again, when new documents have come to light, like, for example, 5 years ago, the globalist diaries came to light. All globalist diaries, with the exception of the year 1944, turned up in Germany. And I thought, well, perhaps I'm going to say farewell to 1,000 pounds this year. They've now been gone over with a fine tooth comb by historians, transcribed, translated, partly published. But again, there's no evidence to prove that I'm wrong. So I'm beginning to suspect that I may perhaps be right. It's an interesting phenomenon. And to show you the kind of problems I came up against, when I told my literary agent about this gap in the evidence, Max Becker down in New York, my literary agent, handled all my work rights, he said, for God's sake, David, don't publish it like that. If you can't find the evidence, all right. Invent it. Create evidence. Just make the claim the same as all the other historians have done. Because if you don't put in something there linking Hitler with that big crime, then I can tell you the result for yourself as a writer. And he meant, of course, that he didn't say between the lines, of course, he minus the 10%. He's going to lose 10% of what I did too. So it's going to hurt him too. And he said, you will lose the Sunday Times deal in England, which was lined up, 3 chapters. You will lose the Reader's Digest, which we also got lined up. You will lose the book of the Month Club. They'd seen the book and they wanted it. And also, you will lose any paperback deal in the United States, which was big money paperbacks. We're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he said you will lose all those 4 deals unless you invent evidence and put it in. So people who occasionally come up to me and say, oh, well, you must have made a lot of money, you must have made a mint out of money out of that kind of nasty controversy of Hitler, claiming that and making all the publicity. The answer is, you get publicity, this is true, but it is unfavorable publicity. And you lose a mint of money for exactly the reasons that he predicted. In fact, all those 4 things happened. The Sunday Times cancelled the serialization deal, and eventually Philip Knightley, a journalist on the Sunday Times, showed me the internal memorandum that led to the cancellation, which was precisely this reason. So you see, it is very, very difficult to get very close to the truth about Adolf Hitler. The documents which tend to exonerate in any way have been suppressed. I mentioned that the documents which are in the files, which are authentic, show him extending his hand to protect the Jews. For example, on the night of the famous pogrom, the night of broken glass, November 9th to 10th, 1938, when Hitler got the news at about 2 o'clock that morning that there were like a bushfire all over Germany, thousands of Jewish shops were being burnt down, stores were being looted, 60 or 70 Jews had been murdered, 100 or 200 synagogues had been burnt to the ground. Hitler got the news of that at 2 o'clock in the morning. The first he heard was that one of the biggest synagogues in Munich was being burnt down. And I know the people who were with him. I questioned them all. They told me the whole story. They say that he sat bolt upright, said what the hell is going on, sent for Goebbels, he sent for Himmler, he sent for all his chiefs, and spent the rest of the night trying to pull out all the organ stops to stop this madness. One of these documents is a 3-line document issued by Rudolf Hess, the number 2 man under Hitler, the deputy Führer. It's in the archives of the American government in Bonn, in Berlin, the Berlin Document Center. And the document says, on order by Rudolf Hess's office, it's an edict number 172 of Linkström 1938. It says, on orders from the very highest level, there are to be no outrages or acts of arson whatsoever under any circumstances against the Jewish community or Jewish buildings. Orders from the very highest level. If the number 2 man writes that, that means that Hitler is moving that night to try and stop these outrages. This document has never been published. I'm the first one to publish it in my biography. Remember, waving this document at university students in Bonn and saying, why is it that your own professors haven't told you about this document? There's only 2 explanations. Either they knew about this document, but they decided to suppress it because they can't fit it in with the modern hypothesis, in which case they're really not fit to be professors, or they were ignorant of this document, in which case, again, they're probably not fitted to be teaching you history. And that's the way it is with the other documents. The next one is the famous telephone call that I discovered from Himmler to the chief of the Gestapo, Reinhard Heydrich, November 1941. Himmler telephoning the chief of the Gestapo saying, transport the Jews from Berlin, not to be liquidated. He's making the phone call from Hitler's bunker. He's obviously been in to see Hitler with his own solution that he wants to suggest. And Hitler said, out of the question, not going to be done. And people might try and put another interpretation on that phone conversation. They might even say, quite rightly, that that shows that liquidation was in the air, it was on the agenda, so to speak. To which I would reply, there's another document I found in the files of the German Ministry of Justice, and I printed in this brochure produced at the press on this brochure. You can see it at the bottom right-hand corner. It's in the files of the Ministry of Justice, and it's dated the spring of 1942. And it records a telephone conversation from the chief German civil servant, rather like a prime minister nowadays, a man directly under Hitler, controlling the German civil service, Hans Lammers. And he's telephoning the Deputy Minister of Justice. And he's saying, read it out in English, but probably in German, yes. He says, the Führer has repeatedly declared to him, to Lammers, that he wants the solution of the Jewish problem postponed until after the war is over. Goes on, but he goes on in that vein. What on earth are we getting up to? Why all this trouble being spent, all this upping and upping, deciding who's a Jew and who's an eighth of a Jew, who's a quarter Jew, and the mixed marriages question, and next of kin, and so on. The Führer says we're fighting a war, exactly the same as it also defined in the question of the German churches and the fight between the Protestants and the Catholics. Hitler said, leave all this until after the war's over, boys, let's win the war first, then we'll tackle these other problems. You can't explain that document, the spring of 1942, any other way, except by my hypothesis that Hitler didn't know that the tragedy had already begun. And yet you won't find documents like these referred to in any of the great works of history by other historians, not even by the Jewish historians like Raoul Hilberg, who in fact corresponds with me and indicates to me privately that he's coming round to my point of view as well, but he's frightened as yet to admit it. These historians probably didn't know these documents existed, for the reasons I told you. They haven't done the legwork. And if they have found the documents, they're rather like card shops, people who cheat at cards. They've dropped the unwelcome card on the floor underneath the table and they're shuffling it away. And they're hoping that no one's going to see this document, but they can't fit it into their hypothesis. Instead of making their hypothesis fit the facts, they make the facts fit the hypothesis, which is an unscientific way to go ahead.
What I'd like to do a question is, your thesis that Martin Gilbert is a card sharp and a type of author?
Martin Gilbert is certainly a card sharp. Let's switch the focus on Martin Gilbert then. Dr. Martin Gilbert is the authorized biographer of Winston Churchill, is he correct, right? He's financed by the Churchill family and by the Jaffa Foundation of Israel. This is also correct. He is the historian who has sole access to all the records of the Churchill Foundation, all the Churchill archives, to the exclusion of all the other historians, whether they're accepted, established, or not. Nobody will get access to the Churchill archives except Martin Gilbert until 10 years after his time of volume is completed, which is probably going to coincide with the next pass of the Harris coming. If we look at one episode in Martin Gilbert's writing, his final volume is such a scandal, it's so full of errors that it's really actually a scandal. If you look at one episode, which is the famous German area in Coventry on November the 14th, 1940, we find him suggesting that Churchill gained the impression that the target was going to be London and returned to London in order to share the suffering of the populace. Now, I have discovered Martin Gilbert is perfectly well aware of documents that I possess, which I have here, which show that Churchill left London that afternoon at 4 o'clock, having received information. I mean, I have Churchill's own desk calendar, you see. I rented it from the man who stole it. And that Churchill left London that afternoon at 4 o'clock, having received from the Ministry a message to the effect that the target was going to be London. That's why he left London. As he opened another message that was handed in to him by the dispatch rider as the car passed Hyde Park in London, the message said the target is not going to be London after all, it's going to be Coventry. He returned to number 10 Downing Street, drive up back to number 10. And he told his staff, then, I have decided to return to London, because it would not be right for the citizens of this fine metropolis to give the impression that I'm unwilling to suffer the same trials and tribulations that they suffer. So Martin Gilbert has actually inverted the truth, although the evidence in front of him shows that Churchill quite clearly had got the message that the target was not London after all, and therefore he returned. And in fact, the final proof is contained in the private diary of Sir John Martin, Churchill's private secretary, which I've also obtained. So I'm rather glad you mentioned the name of Martin Gilbert. His entire biography is a scandal. I passed on to evidence onto Martin Gilbert when he was writing his biography, evidence that Churchill and members of Churchill's famous secret pressure group, the Focus, were being bribed by foreign governments. I passed on this information to Churchill's biographer, and he made no use of it at all. He thanked me very politely, but he made no use of it. And as you may, I am talking about the falsification of evidence because we have become slightly derailed into what was going to be a later part of my talk. We find, for example, in the private diaries of members of Churchill's private clique, which is called the Focus, that they were being bribed, like him, by the Austrian government, by Austrians, and by the Czech government in the period 1936 to 1938. The evidence that Churchill himself was being bribed by the Czechs is contained in the wiretaps of the telephone conversations between the Czech ambassador in London and Prague. And the evidence that his members of parliament were being bribed by the Czech government is contained in the private diaries of some of the members of his group, the Focus. The Focus
these people were taking money to change their political positions.
Well, they don't actually write down in their private papers what they're doing with money. But it's a pretty clear insinuation that if an Austrian approaches the Churchill at the end of February 1938, when the great Austrian crisis is arising, and if this Austrian, Sir Henry Strachan, approaches Mr. Churchill and offers to buy out all his debts, £20,000 of debts, in return for nothing at all. This is contained in the Churchill papers, and if you read the Martin Gilbert volume, you'll find that he's very carefully touched around the dates concerned, but you can see the details very clearly if you look in the papers of the Austrian concerns, Henry Strachan. And then when Austria went down 1 month later, Hitler marched into Austria, then the same group, the Focus, which Churchill was set up, was being funded by the Czechs instead. If we look just at one case, you mentioned, rather raised your eyebrows at the notion that these members of Parliament were wittingly accepting money in order to defend themselves. I can mention two cases. Lord Gooseby, who's still alive, Robert Gooseby, who was in fact Churchill's private parliamentary secretary, and in his cabinet then became an undersecretary for the Board of Trade. He had to resign when it came out that he had accepted a 10% commission from a very wealthy Czech financier who owned a man called Irving. But far more insidious is the payments that were made by Dr. Beneš, the Czech president, £2 million from July 1938 until the Munich Agreement, which were passed to the Conservative and Labour opposition members of Parliament, the Conservative opposition to Chamberlain, of course, the Prime Minister. And we find that these payments were being made between July and September 1938. They were paid directly by Prague to Jan Nazareth, the Czech ambassador in London. He opened a special bank account, a Midland bank account, which wasn't the embassy bank account, in order to handle these payments. I checked his banking stubs. I checked the payments of the records of Dr. Beneš, which are held in the Hoover Library in California. You can actually see the receipts, the bank books there. And the final clincher really is the private diary of the wife of one of the Conservative members of Parliament, General Edward Spears. A quite well-known man, well-known writer. He was one of the Churchill group, the Focus. General Edward Spears was a close friend of Churchill in the First World War. Between the wars, in the Second World War, he acted as Churchill's personal liaison after the end of the world. And as I say, in the period 1938 to 1939, he was a member of this sinister pressure group, the Focus, which Churchill headed. I don't want to explain who financed it first. Who financed the Focus in 1936, because I don't want to arouse a charge of anti-Semitism, but the files are there. But in 1938, the money was coming from Prague. Of course, this was because of the rising Czech crisis. And General Edward Spears' files are now available. You can see his contacts with the Czechs. But more important is the private diary of the wife of General Spears, who was the American novelist Mary Baldwin, who was in fact a relative of the famous Canadian Baldwin. And Mary Baldwin, Lady Spears, her private diary is now in the University of Boston, Massachusetts. I read one entry 3 days after the Munich Agreement was signed, which put an end to Czechoslovakia. You'll see one reason why my Churchill life is running into difficulties. No hope of a seat in the Commons. I go to the cinema with Lenin. Hitler is hissed during the newsreel. This is the wife of a British Conservative member of Parliament, 3 days after the Munich Agreement. Duff Cooper's statement is good, but not in my opinion inspired. There's talk of a general election. Kingsley Wood is trying to work it. If there is one, my husband will lose his seat probably. Faced with the prospect of losing £2,000 a year from the Czechs and his seat in Parliament. No ray of light anywhere. No way of undoing what has been done. How else can you explain this? £2,000 a year from the Czechs. Multiply by 40 to get present Canadian currency. Or worse. And you see the kind of money that's flowing in that direction. The clinching document is in the files of the Czech government now. It's the report of the principal Czech agent in London, Catholic priest, who reported in October 1938, in the month after the Munich Agreement, that it wasn't until the money had come from Prague in July 1938 that he was really in a position to bring pressure to bear on Conservative members of Parliament in opposition to Mr. Chamberlain. You won't find any of this in the Martin Gilbert volume on the 1938 period. I understand it. He's the official Churchill family selected biographer. But you raised the subject, so I'm afraid I thought I had to mention it. There's more of this actually in my lecture which I'm delivering tomorrow night when I speak at the Carlton Inn, when I'm delivering a full-scale lecture with all the documents on the manipulation history about Hitler and about Churchill. If I can revert to my main theme, it is that we British, in fighting the Second World War, from 1940 onwards, the last 5 years of the war, we effectively bankrupted ourselves. In the way that a man sometimes does when he feels very, very deeply about a legal action that he's bringing in order to protect his little country homestead or his farm or something. And he sells off the entire family's silver and all the household goods and everything. And eventually he's declared the winner by the jury. But he crawls out of the law courts on his hands and knees because he's bankrupted himself and he's brought his family to complete ruin for the next 2 or 3 generations. And that's what we did, in fact, with Britain in 1940. We went ahead and fought a war which from 1940 onwards had no point, unless we accepted certain premises. And the premise was, in 1940, we were told by Mr. Churchill that the British Empire was at stake, and that that man, the devil incarnate, was going to wreck the British Empire and invade Britain. And from about 1941 onwards, when America came into the war, of course, America had no interest at all in preserving the British Empire. Imperceptibly, an alternative war aim took over the front pages, which is we were fighting the devil incarnate, a man whom all civilization had to come together to destroy. Eventually, of course, when we then invaded Germany, lo and behold, we found the evidence post facto that we had been right. We captured the concentration camps, we invaded Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, we got the terrible newsreel photographs, the newspaper photographs of British bulldozers tipping the bodies into lime-filled pits and all the rest of it. And it was very easy with this kind of propaganda material, post facto, to justify the awful carnage and destruction the Second World War had done. But now that we have the British and the German files available to us, if we're prepared to be open-minded about it and look at these files, we can see that, in my opinion, I think my hypothesis will eventually turn out to be substantiated, we can see that the German was not really necessary. That from 1940 onwards, June 1940 onwards, the war was pointless. And we should have got out then, the same as Richard Nixon eventually did in 1963 when he got out of Vietnam. There comes a time when a logical statesman has to draw a line under the suffering that's been suffered to that point and say, if I fight on from this point on, I may possibly win, but at a cost of total extinction of my own national interests. We British never unfortunately realized that because we were lied to. The flywheel had begun to spin, and there was no statesman of sufficient rhetorical power, I suppose, who was capable of standing up and holding the flywheel. Now, this isn't just me, the lunatic English historian, saying this. If you look at the records of 1940, you see that for a time in June and July 1940, Churchill was actually willing to accept Hitler's offer. The German offer was peace, pull out of France, pull out of Czechoslovakia and Poland while still leaving Germany to force the disputed areas, leaving him free to invade Russia and the eastern territories. He had no aims against, he had no claims against Britain or the British Empire, although they declared war on them. In fact, he even said by intermediaries that he was willing to assist the British in defending Britain's interests overseas, even against Japan, Russia, and Italy, who were his own allies. This was the German offer. It was so tempting that Churchill occasionally looked at it during those months, June and July, and considered accepting it, particularly on June the 20th and 21st. We know this because in his cabinet of 6 men, his 6-man war cabinet, half the members, 3 of them, wanted peace on Hitler's terms. Lord Halifax, Lord Beaverbrook, the great Canadian, and Neville Chamberlain, the former Prime Minister. They all wanted to accept Hitler's terms. We know that because they wrote private diaries. They describe how Churchill says, for example, if the German terms are such that the sovereignty and independence of Britain and the British Empire are indeed guaranteed, then there's no reason why we shouldn't seriously consider it. That's one thing that Churchill actually said. Of course, it makes nonsense 5 years later to see him say that when he's in the meantime been proclaiming that he's been fighting the devil incarnate. So it is no surprise that if you go for those days to the records of the British Cabinet meetings, you'll find that the British Cabinet meetings, although they're far older than 30 years, they should have been released long ago under the 30-year rule, those records have been blanked out. You're given only photocopies of the appropriate volumes from the British archives, with certain paragraphs blanked out so you can't read them. And unlike most records in English, says, like the Rudolf Hess files, closed until the year 2030, Rudolf Hess. These are blanked out apparently in perpetuity. We will never know what was actually said in the Cabinet on those days, June the 20th, June the 21st, and also similar days in July. Because it is too embarrassing to have to admit that we continue from that point on. It's rather like in a libel action. I've been involved in a libel action. I've been involved in 1 or 2 libel actions. It's rather like in a libel action if you find out that right at the beginning of a costly libel action, which eventually costs you £250,000, as my libel action cost us, that right at the beginning of that action you find out we had a chance to settle out a court for 500. We had a chance in June, July 1940 to settle out a court for nothing. We could have got out of the war for nothing at all. And yet we decided to fight on and bankrupted the empire and sold off all our overseas assets, the Biscoes Corporation, the Venezuelan railroads, all the British Empire's overseas assets, which alone had kept Britain a viable economic entity, were sold off without the British people finding out. Our gold was sold off. Roosevelt actually sent a battleship down to South Africa in December 1940 to collect the empire's final gold reserves. From that point on, we were completely at the mercy of our great American allies, who had not the slightest interest in the preservation of the British Empire. You see, I'm throwing ideas at you that are going to take some time for you to digest, as I said when I began to talk. It's going to take some time for you to digest these ideas, because if I'm right, millions of people died for nothing. They certainly didn't die for the benefit of the British Empire. If the war had ended in June and July 1940, as Churchill from time to time considered, then the European cities would have been left unravaged. Millions of people who were killed in the fighting, about 20 million people from that point on, would not have been killed. The 6 million, I put that figure in quotation marks, because I don't really thought that I was agreeing that that's the correct figure. The 6 million all died in the period after June, July 1940. So if the war had ended then, there's at least a fair chance that another, less unpleasant fate would have been meted out. Probably the Madagascar solution, which Hitler was so fond of talking about, or some other territorial solution like that. These are great, big, substantial questions that you can't just ignore. But the questions are so big, so dazzling, that there is a class of writer, a class of historian who prefers to ignore them, prefers to pretend that these questions don't exist at all. But they do exist. They're the big, logical questions that people don't like to ask because of the awful implications, if I'm right. If we hadn't continued fighting those last 5 years of the war, Britain would now be the predominant force. Britain and the British Empire, we would be in the position of the United States and the Soviet Union combined. We could bring our great civilizing influence to bear throughout the world, same as we had done in the previous 200 or 300 years. I've been around there the last five weeks. I've seen what we British did, and I'm proud of what we did in South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and here in Canada. Not the slightest reason to be ashamed or to hang our head of anything we did in those 200 or 300 years. We could have continued, even if it was only for 50 years, it would have been worthwhile. Instead of which, for the opportunist motives of one politician, Winston Churchill, we fought on. We fought on because he dictated to us the terms. He was such a magnificent orator that we believed him blindly and implicitly. And because he knew how, like the Dutch boy, to plug his finger in every hole in the dike when there was the slightest chance that Hitler's peace offer would come there to the British. That's why Rudolf Hess is now still in prison, under orders never to speak. He can't speak to anyone. 92 years old, he's held in prison in Berlin, half blind. He's been in prison for the last 46 years of his life, ever since he came to England with the German peace offer. Been in solitary confinement for the last 18 years. You hear a lot about poor old Nelson Mandela, a convicted communist terrorist, an agent who's been in prison for 20 years because he won't give his word not to continue doing wicked things when he comes out. But poor old Rudolf Hess is going to rotting in jail where he's been for 46 years. And we talk about crimes against humanity. You see, I don't care what people think about me, I don't care what names they label me, but I do pride myself that I am capable of thinking logically and clearly with as little hypocrisy as possible. There's a little bit of hypocrite about all of this, of course. But on these broad historical issues, I have, I think, evolved a version of history